Well, it's been a few weeks since the election, and I wanted to put some of my thoughts out there both on the outcome and on the process itself. First, this was definitely the most politically divisive election cycle in my lifetime, and I find that to be particularly strange. Even for those individuals who actually settled on voting for one of the candidates in particular, the only actual appeal behind those candidates seems to be that they were not the opposing candidate. This entire election cycle has more or less been an expression of the disenfranchisement of the American people with our political system. The majority opinion here seems to be that both candidates sucked, the entire system sucks, and at this point almost no one is willing to participate in the system itself, which begs the question why this was so divisive if everyone is of such a uniform mind. It's no secret that politics is naturally divisive, and we have it even worse in America where we really only have a two-party system which naturally fosters an us versus them mentality. Add on top of that the overall degeneration of media coverage over time, and it seems that we're more and more being characterized in both sides of the political spectrum by the extremists in our group. Extremists on the far right might be characterized by their pursuit of Christian theocracy, as has been the case for the last few election cycles, as well as things like racism and misogyny that have been generally used to constitute the blanket statement that people have been applying to all Trump voters. Meanwhile, on the extreme left, you have people telling you that it's racist to wear dreadlocks if you're white, or enjoy rap music if you're white, or basically just to be white at all. There's of course also huge amounts of science denial on both sides. On the conservative-leaning side, that tends to be things like climate change denial, as well as pushing creationism as part of that pursuit of a Christian theocracy I mentioned earlier. And on the left, it seems to be more along the lines of attacking genetically modified organisms, vaccine denial, and things of that nature. The problem here arises when what were once trustworthy media outlets are spending more and more time focusing on these fringe groups because they're more entertaining for the viewer, despite the fact that they represent a very, very small minority of people in that voting base. You're suddenly taking the vast majority of voters who are centrists, mostly leaning slightly right or left depending on each individual's political values, and splitting them right down the middle and forcing them very, very far left or very, very far right as a reactionary tactic against what they perceive to be the extremist values that are taking over one or the other side. The vast majority of Trump voters, for example, aren't actually racists who just want to arbitrarily eliminate brown people from the United States population. They're people who are voting in retaliation to that extreme kind of political correctness that tells them that being a white individual makes them fundamentally bad. So, as a result, we've moved away from a natural bell curve distribution of voters to something more akin to a Chinese finger trap with two huge voting bases desperately trying to pull away as far as possible from each other. This has serious consequences for the American people, though. For example, we're fragmenting our voter base down and obfuscating how widespread support for some legislation is. Just to use one example, gun rights is always a contentious subject here in America, and on the right you definitely have slightly more resistance to gun legislation than on the left. However, you might be surprised to learn that some of the forms of legislation, like the idea of having mandatory background checks for gun purchases, is supported by more than 90% of Americans on both the left and the right side. These types of issues get buried beneath the dichotomous thinking we have in this two-party system, and thus common sense legislation that's supported by the vast majority of Americans doesn't get passed. This issue becomes even more pronounced if you look at the House itself, where you more or less have people voting for or against propositions purely based on party affiliation rather than their actual impact on the American people. This keeps both policy changes and system reform forever out of our reach until we can find a way to break down the divisiveness of politics in America and unify towards common goals. With all that said, I'm not incredibly surprised about the results of the election either. Hillary Clinton very much represents the status quo of American politics, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been disenfranchising Americans from every perspective for a long time. People are frankly sick of politicians for whom lying is a trade skill, and despite the endless amounts of pandering they do to every voting demographic they possibly can, only really appearing to have selfish motivations for the actual policy decisions and the pursuit of the station of president. This is a bit ironic since Donald Trump has been caught lying as part of this election cycle more than any other presidential candidate in my lifetime. PolitiFact has his running tally of honesty at around 50%, which is amazingly low considering that politicians like Hillary Clinton, who are infamous for how frequently they lie, have an honesty rating in the 70 to 80% range in general. His lies are also often more childish and hilarious in the sense that he'll often say, "I never said that," when exactly word for word tweeted the same thing only days earlier. Despite all that, he is definitely a master of creating this narrative of being against the political establishment, and thus it's no surprise that he was successful in his campaign for presidency. So that brings us to the question, how concerned am I, or how concerned do I think we should be about a Trump presidency? The truth is, I'm not nearly as concerned as most people are, and there are a few reasons for that. For one, most of the big suggestions that he made as part of his campaign are downright impossible. Building a wall between us and Mexico, for example, would be far too expensive to actually pursue. He, of course, said he would make Mexico pay for it, which is not only flatly ridiculous on its face, but the Mexican president has expressly stated that he would not. On top of that, a 40-foot wall is completely useless in the face of a 41-foot ladder, so we would need to have manned guards along the entire length of the wall in order for it to be effective at reducing the amount of illegal immigration at all. Having armed guards along the entire southern border would obviously be far too expensive to pay salaries, and so just from every perspective, this is a flatly ridiculous proposition. He also suggested that he would somehow round up and then deport all of the current illegal immigrants in the United States, which again would be far too expensive just to pay for the manpower as well as logistically impossible. His suggestion that we would stop Muslims from visiting the country as well as putting all current American citizens who happen to be Muslims on a registry is also in flagrant defiance of the First Amendment of the United States and flatly illegal as a result. Not to mention his idea of expanding libel laws, which would again be a violation of the First Amendment. This trend holds true for pretty much every major proposition that he made as part of his candidacy, and I do take a bit of solace in the fact that all of the major policy changes he's come up with would be impossible to implement. That is, of course, not to say that we don't have some things to be concerned about. Between Trump and the conservative majority in the House, we may see something reminiscent of Trump's tax plan actually passed, and economists nationwide from all political affiliations have condemned that tax plan not only as contributing to wealth disparity in the United States, crushing the middle class, and further increasing poverty rates, but also just in general destabilizing the American economy and potentially plunging us back into the recession that we're just starting to crawl back out of. Furthermore, with a right-leaning Supreme Court, there is a real possibility we could overturn the Roe v. Wade decision, which is another thing that he proposed, which would represent a pretty serious step back in terms of individual freedoms and reproductive rights. Taking into account the fact that his radical propositions are across the board impossible, and his less radical propositions are things that are echoed by all of the conservative candidates anyway, I'm really no more concerned about a Trump presidency than I would be any other conservative presidency. In fact, what concerns me most about Trump's presidency is what impact this has on America's image in foreign countries. It's no secret that that image is already probably quite a bit less positive than we might like to think it is. However, outside the United States, there seems to be almost universal agreement that Trump is just an absolute buffoon in all respects. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. 10 or 20 years ago, before Donald Trump made his emergence onto the political scene, his image in the public eye was largely of a fool. He is in every respect the poster boy of American exceptionalism and narcissistic thinking to the extreme, and so the fact that we've made this transition in only 10 or 20 years from Donald Trump being the sort of tongue-in-cheek mascot for all of the negative cliches about America to him actually being the President of the United States, I think has a very, very damaging effect to America's image worldwide. Because of the fact that we exert such extreme economic power worldwide as well as military power, I doubt there's going to be any sort of substantive consequences as a result of this shift in thinking for the time being, but I find it difficult to think that anyone's ever going to take the United States seriously again in the near future. Only time will tell how that turns out, and of course one of the many fraud lawsuits that are currently pending against Trump may turn out to be a conviction for fraud, and of course we may see an impeachment as a result of that. If nothing else, I hope this election has served as an example for the next round that we need to unify as a voting base. The vast majority of people in both party affiliations are rational thinking people with their best interests at heart. This divisiveness is just another way for the system to take advantage of the people rather than to tend to the needs of the people as a government should be in the idealistic sense. The saying is, after all, divide and conquer. Take this opportunity to try and find some common ground with friends and family that you love that maybe don't share the same political values you do, and I'll see you guys in the next video.